Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We will now begin. Story 1. How Inuit hunters kept warm without doing anything interesting. The Arctic air does not announce itself loudly. It arrives like a slow exhale over the tundra, a sigh that lasts 8 months. You feel it settle into the bones of the igloo, press into the sinews of your joints, and rest in the folds of sealskin boots. In this first section, we'll walk slowly through the invisible steps that kept Inuit hunters alive in a place where boredom was more dependable than sunlight. The Inuit didn't need to invent anything dramatic to survive. There were no fires blazing in the center of the home, no loud rituals of dance or speech to break the stillness of the white-draped world. There was snow. There was meat. There was patience. It was enough. The igloo, boredom built with snow bricks. The snow house, commonly called an igloo, or igloo in Inuktitut, was a masterclass in inert engineering. Built with blocks of snow and nothing else, the igloo was not dramatic in construction. It required no nails, no ceremonial foundation, and no grand architectural drawing. A person with a curved bone blade and a slow afternoon could construct one in a few hours. The blocks were cut from hard-packed snow, stacked in a spiral that leaned inward, and finally capped with a closing tile of snow that shut out the wind and the world. Inside it was dim. The light filtered in a bluish haze through the snow walls. There was no sound. Heat came not from fire but from people, dogs, and oil lamps called quilik. The lamps were fueled with seal or whale blubber and gave off a faint, greasy warmth. It was not comfortable, but it was survivable. The floor was divided. Sleeping areas were raised, built from hard-packed snow, covered in caribou hides. This elevation allowed cold air to settle below and the minimal warmth to remain near the sleepers. No fluff, no feather beds, just hide, snow, and the knowledge that movement burned calories that could not be wasted. Clothing, the quiet armor of caribou and seal. The Inuit did not layer their clothing for style, and certainly not for haste. Each piece was an insulation decision that might determine whether they saw spring. The inner parka was usually made of caribou hide, worn with the fur facing inward to trap body heat. The outer parka also used caribou or seal, fur out, to repel moisture and wind. Boots were made from sealskin kamiks, which had to be regularly dried, scraped, and softened. Gloves were layered similarly, often requiring 2 or 3 pairs to keep hands from freezing into silence. There was no flash, no decoration, no ceremony in donning this armor. Dressing could take 20 minutes. It had to be done slowly with attention in silence. The wrong seam, a tear, or forgotten boot wrap could mean frostbite in hours. And when the temperature dipped below degrees C, clothing wasn't warmth, it was a form of passive resistance. You weren't comfortable. You simply weren't dying yet. The quilik, a flame for nothing interesting. The quilik flickered but never danced. This shallow soapstone lamp held rendered seal fat and a wick made from moss or cotton grass. Its flame was modest, unimpressive, and constant. It did not heat a room, but it stopped water from freezing. It softened skins. It warmed a meal slowly, sometimes over many hours. Women tended the quilik. It was rarely mentioned in stories or songs, but every home had one, and without it, the slow machinery of Arctic life would grind to a halt. A woman would sit near the lamp and use a spoon to manage the pool of fat. She would trim the moss wick. She would scrape the soot and relight it when needed. She might do this dozens of times a day. Each task was essential. None was considered interesting. Food, raw, frozen, and unexcitingly necessary. Inuit diets were monotonous by Southern standards. There were no vegetables, no bread, no spices. What there was, meat, fat, and blood. Seal was the staple. Hunted by patient men waiting at breathing holes in the ice, the seal was butchered with speed and preserved without ceremony. Most of it was eaten raw or frozen. Frozen seal liver was considered a delicacy, and fresh blood was sometimes drunk immediately for warmth and energy. There was no cooking as you know it. Boiling was rare and baking was a foreign fantasy. Meals were silent, unadorned, and extremely efficient. Food was fuel, not flavor. Fat, especially, was precious. One could survive on seal fat alone for weeks, some did. Daily life, the stillness between movements. The days were long or short depending on the season, but always uneventful. The Arctic did not provide interruptions. There was no market, no writing, no government buildings or chores of currency. Time passed like snow gathering at the edge of a roof. Hunters prepared gear. Women sewed, and activity given extraordinary attention. Needles were made of bone, thread from sinew. One parka could take weeks. Mistakes were unacceptable, and so silence reigned. The only sound was the slow pull of sinew through skin. Children learned by watching. No lectures, no classrooms. A boy might sit for days watching his uncle adjust a harpoon head. No questions were asked unless invited. Learning was passive, boring, and deeply effective. Rest, sleep as survival. Sleeping was not indulgent. It was metabolic conservation. Families huddled under hides on the raised sleeping platforms. There were no separate rooms. Everyone heard everything, but no one spoke. Dreams were not shared unless they were important. Most weren't. You slept when it was dark. You woke when it was dim, or when someone stirred to check the quilic. The rhythm of sleep was uninterrupted by clocks or alarms. Only hunger or cold could break it. Sometimes a dog would bark, sometimes the wind howled, otherwise silence. The philosophy of doing nothing. For the Inuit, survival wasn't dramatic. It was about learning to do very little, very slowly. It was about understanding when to move and when to wait. The knowledge passed down wasn't in speeches, but in the angle of a sled runner or the way a glove was hung to dry. Children learned patience. Adults practiced it. The landscape rewarded nothing but restraint. And in the middle of that frozen patience, they stayed alive because they knew the price of doing too much, too quickly. But what happens when the wind changes and the ice no longer obeys the old patterns? What happens when boredom becomes danger? The Arctic may appear still, but nothing in it stays put forever. The ice cracks. The sky dims and brightens on its own slow schedule. Seal populations shift. Even boredom can become dangerous when survival depends on expectations. We'll explore what happened when predictable patterns, the quiet rules of Inuit life, began to shift beneath the snow. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden disaster or war. Just subtle, creeping changes. Wind patterns altered. Ice flows shifted. Animals went missing. But all these changes arrived as they always did in the Arctic, slowly, silently, and without explanation. When the ice became unreliable. To the Inuit hunter, the sea ice was not a mystery, it was a map. Every ridge, crack, and pressure point had a name. Every seal breathing hole was memorized. Hunters could walk over what looked like uniform white plains and know exactly where they were. But sometimes something shifted. The sea ice might crack earlier than expected. The snow might become softer. Water seeped upward. What had been firm beneath a hunter's foot yesterday was now unreliable, and no one announced the change. The earth didn't make a sound. This didn't cause panic. There was no sprint back to the igloo. There was no yelling. Instead, the hunter sat. He waited. He felt the snow with his hands. He might use the blunt handle of a harpoon to tap the ice and listen to the sound it made, hollow or solid. The solution was not to stop hunting. It was to slow down even more. The quiet loss of a seal hole. Seal hunting was never a fast pursuit. You didn't chase a seal. You didn't track it across the ice. Instead, you found a breathing hole called an igloo and you waited. Hunters built small snow walls to shield from the wind. They lay flat on their stomachs, their arms extended, the harpoon resting beside them. They could stay that way for hours. Sometimes they'd fall asleep in place, trusting their bodies to wake at the faint sound of a seal surfacing. But when climate patterns shifted even slightly, the igloo moved. They might freeze over or be abandoned. The hunter could wait in perfect stillness for 14 hours and return with nothing. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't even upsetting. It was expected. You tried again the next day, but it meant hunger for your family. It meant rations would be thin. A soft shift in temperature far away could mean silence at the hole near home. No announcement, no explosion, just nothing. The disappearance of caribou. Further inland, the Inuit depended on caribou for their warmest clothing. Caribou fur is hollow, each hair traps air, insulating better than seal or bear. A good parka could save your life in a blizzard, but making that parka required the animal, and caribou had patterns of migration that could last centuries until they didn't. In the 18th and 19th centuries, oral histories mention years when the caribou failed to arrive. The herds had moved routes, their migrations altered. Some said they smelled new human settlements to the south. Others blamed changes in lichen growth due to altered snowfall. Either way, the result was the same: no new hides. Old parkas had to be patched again and again until they failed entirely. Hunters took greater risks. Some walked for weeks. A few did not return. But there were no town meetings, no declared famine, just quiet adjustments. People sewed more sealskin instead. They stitched layers together with sinew and hope. Still, it wasn't as warm, and everyone knew it. The storms that didn't speak. Most storms in the Arctic didn't begin with thunder. There was no roll of ominous clouds. There were only soft warnings, a shift in wind, a silence from the dogs, a pressure in the air. Some blizzards began, as if the sky simply forgot it was time to be still. A man walking back from a fishing line might look up and find he could no longer see his own outstretched hand. The snow fell sideways, then upward, then in circles. His skin froze before his thoughts could catch up. But he didn't run. Running burned fuel. He stopped. He covered his mouth. He dropped to the snow and waited, building a shallow scoop of snow over himself. This was not heroism, it was protocol. Others died not from exposure but from drifting slightly in the wrong direction. You could walk 50 steps off course and never find your igloo again. In whiteout conditions, even the sun had no direction. Some Inuit carried small markers, whalebone staves planted in the snow like breadcrumbs. But if a storm lasted longer than expected, those too disappeared beneath the drifts. Death did not come with drama. It came with silence and the absence of your footprints. The dogs that stopped barking. Sled dogs were lifelines. They pulled heavy loads, guided hunters across impossible terrain, and warned of intruders or approaching bears. But dogs were not invincible. When the ice shifted or when blizzards struck, dogs became confused. They hesitated, refused commands, or whined at unseen forces. Sometimes they simply sat down and would not move. There are quiet stories told about dog teams that died where they stood buried in snow, still in their harnesses. Or of lone dogs returning, their traces tangled, the sled gone. When a dog stopped barking, it wasn't just a moment of peace. It was a warning. People listened. The coughs in the quiet. Disease wasn't common in isolated Inuit communities until contact with traders, missionaries, and explorers. When foreign illnesses arrived, they did not begin with grand symptoms. They started with fatigue. A child stopped helping with the sewing. A man sat longer than usual near the lamp. Someone coughed once, twice, and then not again. But days later that cough became fever. The quilik was left unattended. The snow house grew colder. No one stirred to cut fresh meat. The silence that had once been peaceful became heavy. Influenza, tuberculosis, and other respiratory illnesses swept through communities like snowdrifts, slow, cold, and complete. And the elders, who had survived harsher winters, now sat wrapped in hides they could no longer maintain. The silence of death resembled the silence of survival. Adaptation without announcements. The Inuit adapted not through revolution or reinvention, but by observation and steady change. When traditional ice paths became unreliable, new sled routes were tested. When fat sources declined, other animals were added to the diet. Fishing through the ice became more common. Women learned to double sew sealskin in place of caribou. Lamps were packed with extra moss to increase heat. Children were taught to listen more carefully, to watch cloud behavior, to read cracks in the snow no wider than a finger. They adapted slowly, without speeches. There was no meeting in the central igloo to announce a new era. It simply arrived. They noticed, they adjusted. The role of memory. Elders remembered ice that did not crack in April. They remembered birds that arrived in March, not May. They remembered where the caribou had once crossed and where they never came again. But memory in Inuit culture was not nostalgia. It was utility. Elders spoke quietly of these changes, not to mourn but to inform. The rhythm of life in the Arctic was built on memory more than prediction. And so a new generation grew up in homes where things felt slightly off. The wind came from a strange direction. The seals were leaner. The dogs barked less often. They were taught not to panic, only to listen, to feel, to remember. Boredom becomes a warning system. In a culture where days passed in stillness, even subtle shifts were meaningful. The Arctic did not offer luxury, but it offered a kind of dependable dullness. You could count on the sun to move slowly, the ice to crack on schedule, the dogs to pull when asked. When those routines broke, boredom itself became a warning system. A quilik that smoked too much, a parka that froze stiff in 1 hour instead of 2, a seal that did not come to its breathing hole. These weren't events, they were absences, the quiet vanishing of expected details. And that made them terrifying. If stillness and silence were once the guardians of survival, what happens when even those can no longer be trusted? When the Arctic changed, it did not do so for the sake of drama. It shifted like the snowpack imperceptibly until your sled dropped through a crevasse. By the time you realized something was different, it had already been that way for a while. How the Inuit held onto their stillness even as the world around them stirred with the faint tremors of outside contact, ecological shifts, and slow-moving cultural erosion. It was not a collapse. There was no conquest, just the intrusion of noise where silence had once ruled. And still, many Inuit adapted without resistance. They sowed new things, learned new paths, and tried, whenever possible, to keep warm without doing anything interesting. The arrival of outsiders, talk, trade, and trouble. The first Europeans who came north did so poorly. They came with flags and frostbite. Their ships, thick-hulled and wrong for ice, became prison cells by the second week of winter. The men huddled inside, ate dwindling supplies, and drank spirits that warmed only briefly. They brought tools, metal blades, beads, tea, sugar, and disease. To the Inuit, these new visitors were curious, but rarely alarming. They watched them build fires that smoked inefficiently. They listened to the way they shouted orders, made plans, and then froze anyway. Sometimes they helped, trading fur for knives or sharing dried meat in exchange for thread. But the noise was troubling, not because it was loud, but because it was constant. The Inuit had long known that energy was not infinite. Every motion, every word, every laugh was a choice. The newcomers laughed too often. They moved too much. And often they died. The Inuit did not interfere. They watched, and when they could, they offered advice rarely followed. Then they returned to their slow, quiet, deliberate lives. Missionaries and the reshaping of belief. Later, missionaries arrived, Moravians, Anglicans, Catholics, each convinced that what the Inuit needed most was a new religion, a new way to live, and the dignity of boredom that came with sermons and Sunday clothes. Some Inuit converted, many did not. But even for those who embraced Christianity, the rhythms of life could not be erased. The snow still required sealing. The seal still required patience. A parka still needed to be stitched without hurry. Hymns were learned, yes, but so were the tides. A child might hear the story of Jesus in the morning, and then learn how to tie a dog sled trace that afternoon. Neither skill contradicted the other. But some missionaries demanded more. They pushed for permanent houses, for schools, for an end to idleness. They did not understand that idleness was survival. Some Inuit moved to settlements. Others stayed in their snow homes, just farther from the missionaries' reach. The lamp still needed tending. The quiet collapse of the traditional hunt. As contact with the outside world deepened, so did dependency. Metal tools replaced bone, rifles replaced harpoons, wooden sleds arrived, then snowmobiles. At first these were marvels. A snowmobile could take a hunter 10 times farther, but it required fuel, and the fuel came from far away on boats or planes. If a shipment didn't arrive, the machine sat still, useless. The old tools, by contrast, needed nothing but hands, patience, and maintenance. Some families kept both a harpoon and a rifle, a snowmobile and a sled. But gradually, fewer knew how to build the old tools, and when the ice cracked unpredictably under the weight of the new machines, there were no elders left who remembered how to read the sound of it. More hunters died, fewer seals were caught. Clothing changed too. Factory-made parkas were waterproof, wind-resistant, brightly colored, but they didn't breathe like caribou. They didn't layer the same. They tore easily, and no one knew how to fix them. Even quilics faded. Electric heaters and stoves became common, but when the power failed, which it often did, families found themselves cold in houses not built for the Arctic, with no oil lamp to relight. The silence, once sacred, had been replaced by humming appliances. And then silence again, but this time dangerous. The rise of settlements and the fall of seasonal movement. Traditionally, Inuit communities moved with the seasons. Winter camped near the ice, spring by the river mouth, summer inland for caribou, autumn on the coast. Each move was slow, planned, and essential. The land was not fixed, so people could not be. But modern settlements changed this. In the 20th century, governments, especially in Canada and Greenland, encouraged or forced Inuit communities to stay in fixed villages. Children were sent to boarding schools. Health clinics were built. Stores offered southern foods and goods. Dog sleds were banned in some places, replaced by skidoos and roads. At first the houses felt warm. They had stoves, they had beds, but they couldn't be moved. When food ran low, families could not follow the herds. When ice shifted, they could not pack up and go. The rhythm broke. Some elders sat on porches and looked at the horizon they once crossed every year. They remembered when boredom was the price of mobility. Now, stillness had become confinement. The silence felt heavier. Erosion of language and the whisper of memory. The Inuktitut language holds more words for snow than English has for joy, but fewer children learn it today. In school, English and Danish and French are taught first. Inuktitut is taught, if at all, as a heritage subject, something quaint, something optional. But language is not ornamental. It carries instructions, the way a seam is described, the way an ice crack is named. The difference between a good seal breathing hole and a dangerous one can be a single syllable. When that word is lost, the knowledge dims. Elders speak quietly now. Some wait for someone to ask, many do not. In some villages, language nests have been built small schools where children spend hours immersed in Inuktitut with elders. The sound of the old words fills the room. But outside, the roads still hum, phones buzz, distant planes trace contrails across the pale blue sky. The past is whispered, the present speaks louder. Small resistances, sewing circles and sleeping outside. Still, some traditions hold. Women gather in sewing circles not to protest but to remember. They stitch parkas in the old way. They talk about their grandmothers. They complain about modern zippers. They laugh softly. They stitch for hours. Sometimes they teach young women. Sometimes no one comes. Still they sew. Some hunters still choose the harpoon, not because it is better but because it feels right. It demands the old patience, the old timing. A seal struck with a harpoon is honored more than one felled by a bullet. Some families sleep in snow shelters for fun, a return to the old rhythms if only for a night. They light a quillick, they eat frozen fish, they say little. The silence returns. It feels like a memory, not a prison. Reflections in the ice, what stillness meant. For centuries, the Inuit survived not by conquering the Arctic but by yielding to it. They embraced its silence, matched its pace, and did nothing more than was needed. Their boredom was never laziness, it was wisdom. They did not need to invent complicated technologies. Their tools were simple because they worked. Their stories were quiet because they were true. Their homes were temporary because nothing in the Arctic stays forever. And when the outside world arrived talking fast, moving fast, promising faster futures, the Inuit watched. Some joined, some resisted, most adapted silently. But something was lost. Not culture, not entirely, not even language, not yet. What was lost was the comfort of being still in a world that respected stillness. Today, some Inuit youth feel restless. They live between two rhythms, the slow heartbeat of the tundra and the loud, flickering pace of the screen. They struggle to find balance. So did their ancestors. But the snow still falls, the seals still breathe, and somewhere a woman still trims a moss wick in a stone lamp, not for nostalgia, but because the flame still matters. A final thought. What does it mean to live in harmony with a place that does not change for you? What happens when stillness itself becomes an act of resistance? Story 2. The Daily Itch of Wool, Life in a 14th Century English Cottage. The year is 1346. The 100 Years' War rumbles far in the distance. The Black Death hasn't yet arrived, but its shadow creeps slowly westward. You, however, are not concerned with that. You're waking up in a small cottage on the edge of a muddy lane in Norfolk. You're more worried about whether the fire went out during the night and if the wool tunic you sleep in has gathered too many lice. This story is about daily life. Not kings or plagues or war, but the slow, scratchy rhythm of waking, working, eating, and sleeping in a medieval English village. You are not a knight. You are not even a merchant. You are a peasant, an ordinary one, and your story is worth telling not because of anything dramatic, but because it was the life of nearly everyone. The cottage, one room, many smells. You sleep in a one-room wattle and daub house. That means the walls are made of woven sticks daubed with mud, straw, and animal dung. The roof is thatched dried reeds and rushes layered thick to keep the rain out. Sometimes it works. The floor is earth. It is always earth. In wet months it becomes mud. In dry months it turns to dust. Your feet know it intimately. There are no bedrooms, no privacy. The entire family sleeps in one space. If you're lucky, your parents have a small straw-stuffed mattress near the fire. You and your siblings might share a thin blanket on a raised plank or simply nestle into the straw. The fire is the center of the house, not for luxury, not for gathering, simply for heat and for cooking what little can be cooked. If you're fortunate, it smolders through the night. If not, you wake cold and curse the ash. And you always wake early. There are no curtains, no clocks, just the pale gray light of dawn spilling across your closed eyes and the scratching of mice in the thatch above. The clothes will always will. Your clothes are simple, a tunic made of coarse wool. It is brown, gray, or the faded remains of a dyed blue once vibrant, now the color of wet stone. You wear the same one every day. There are no wardrobes, no options. Underneath, perhaps a linen shirt if your family owns such a luxury. Linen itches less, but linen is labor-intensive and your mother says it tears too easily. Wool lasts longer. You pull on wool hose, likely uneven and sagging. You tie them to your tunic with cords to keep them from falling. Your shoes are leather if you own shoes at all. Otherwise, it's bare feet on the dirt. Everything smells faintly of sheep, smoke, and damp. Wool is scratchy. Always, it never stops itching. You learn to ignore it. You stop noticing unless the lice return, which they always do. Breakfast, bread if anything. There is no breakfast in the modern sense. The fire is coaxed back to life with damp sticks. Someone, your mother or an older sibling, rakes the ashes to find embers, blowing gently to revive them. If it takes too long, there will be no warm food this morning. If bread was baked yesterday, you eat a chunk. It's coarse, dark, and heavy. Rye or barley most likely. Wheat is for the rich and the Lord's table. Butter is rare. Eggs rarer still. Honey, only in stories. Most days it's bread alone. On fast days, and there are many, you don't eat until later. The church calendar governs everything, including your stomach. You may drink a weak ale. It is safer than water, which may carry disease. It doesn't make you drunk, it's too thin for that, but it warms your belly. You chew slowly, you don't speak, there's nothing to say. Outside, the crows are already calling. Work begins, the fields are waiting. Your family works a small strip of land. You don't own it. You hold it from the local lord, who in turn holds it from someone higher. The king, perhaps, though that matters little here. You owe rent not in money, but in labor, grain, or livestock. You work your own strip, but you also work the Lord's domain, his fields, his animals, his harvest. The tools are few. A wooden plow, iron-tipped if you're lucky. A hoe, a sickle, everything is handmade and frequently mended. You sow barley in spring. You weed through summer. You reap in late summer and fall. If you are a woman, you might glean behind the harvesters collecting leftover grain for your family's survival. Children work as soon as they can walk, fetching water, chasing birds from crops, scaring off wolves from sheep, carrying baskets. No school, no books, just apprenticeship through repetition. You are often hungry, you are always tired. The Lord's man comes around. Once or twice a week, the reeve or bailiff, a man appointed by the Lord, walks the village. He carries a ledger, he notes who owes what. He watches the fields, he inspects fences, he counts sheep. You do not speak to him unless he speaks first. You do not argue. If he says your yield is too small, you accept it. If he claims your pig for the Lord's feast, you hand it over. Sometimes he brings word from the manor house, a demand for labor, a change in rent, a new edict about gathering firewood from the forest. You listen, you nod, you go back to weeding. The forest in the law. You are not allowed to hunt. That is for the nobility. The king's deer are not your deer. Even gathering firewood is regulated. Dead branches may be taken. Live wood, forbidden. Still you go, quietly. You pick mushrooms. You cut kindling when no one watches. You teach your children which berries are safe, which roots to dig. If caught, punishment is swift. Fines if you can pay. Stocks or flogging if you can't. Still you go back. There is no other place to find warmth in winter. The forest is both a refuge and a threat. Midday meal, pottage and patience. Lunch, if there is one, is pottage, a thick stew of grains, root vegetables, maybe beans, and on good days, a scrap of meat or bone for flavor. It simmers over the fire all morning. You eat from a shared wooden bowl. You dip hard bread into it. You chew slowly. There are no utensils for the poor. Fingers and crusts suffice. You eat in silence or low voices. There is always more to do. The field is never truly finished. The fence always needs mending. Someone is always sick. You do not linger. There are no chairs to linger in. The church bell marks the hours. You do not own a clock, but time still matters. The church bell rings to mark the canonical hours. You know them by sound. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. You don't attend them all, but you hear them. They break the day into segments. They remind you that time belongs to God. On Sundays, you go to church. Attendance is mandatory. You kneel on cold stone. The priest speaks Latin. You do not understand the words, but you understand the rhythm, the incense, the chants, the symbols. You confess. You are reminded that life is suffering and that heaven is for the obedient. Then you go home and dig potatoes. Evening, the fire, the itch, and the dark. As the sun drops, you return home. You may carry wood. You may bring a basket of vegetables. You may come empty-handed. The fire is built again. Dinner is often the same as lunch, reheated pottage if any remains. You eat in silence or whisper. The fire flickers. The shadows lengthen. You scratch your arms. The lice are active again. Your sister picks them from your collar, cracks them between her nails. Your mother sews by firelight. She squints. Her eyes are failing, her stitches slow. The wind sighs against the thatch. You sleep early. There are no lamps, no books, no distractions, just exhaustion. You lie on the straw, still dressed. You pull the blanket over your head to keep the fleas out. You listen to the mice above and your father's slow breathing. You fall asleep thinking of tomorrow. It will be exactly the same. An unresolved question. If nothing ever changes, and each day is a copy of the last, how did people find meaning in the rhythm of repetition? Life in a 14th century English village was not punctuated by the sort of moments we think of as historical. No battles, no treaties, no discoveries. Just one muddy step after another. And yet, this rhythm, slow, repetitive, and almost invisible, was the foundation of medieval English society. We continue following an ordinary peasant's day, but look more closely at the routines that stitched the quiet life together. The unremarkable skills passed through generations, the expectations of gender and family roles, and the small calendar of events that broke the sameness, if only briefly. These are not the details of history classes, but they are the framework that held history in place. The work behind the work, invisible labor. Much of the labor in a medieval village wasn't farming, it was everything that supported farming. Every hour not spent in the field was an hour spent preparing to return to it. Shoes needed mending, tools needed sharpening, hens needed plucking. Herbs had to be dried, stored, and remembered. Salt was precious, not because it flavored food, but because it preserved what little meat you had. The wool that itched your arms had to be cleaned, carded, spun, and woven by hand. This was often the task of women and older children. It could take weeks to produce enough cloth for a single tunic, and even then it was coarse and imperfect. A spindle was as common as a spoon. There was no factory, no shortcut. Everything in your cottage existed because someone, usually your mother or sister, made it slowly, quietly, and without expectation of thanks. Women's work, ceaseless and silent. In the medieval village, the roles of women were defined not by law, but by repetition. A woman's day was not marked by tasks, but by interruptions. She rose first, stirred the fire, fed the animals, drew water several trips a day, each requiring heavy jugs carried from a communal well or stream. She made bread dough, she spun wool, she sewed. She scolded children, she wiped, she plucked. She scraped fat from hides. She bled a chicken when it was time. She prepared pottage again. Then she laid down to sleep in the same tunic she'd worn since spring. There were few breaks. Leisure was rare and usually spent doing something that could still count as productive mending or praying. Pregnancy was constant. Childbirth was frequent and dangerous. Children often died. So did mothers. There was no midwife in most villages, just a neighbor who had seen enough births to know when to worry. But women did not consider this extraordinary. It was simply the shape of life. Children born to work, trained to repeat. There was no concept of childhood as we know it. By the age of 5, children had chores. By 7, they were considered small workers. By 12, they could be married. Boys might be sent to a neighboring manor to work as a page or a servant if the family had connections. Girls might join another household to learn good domestic habits or simply to reduce the mouths at home. School was rare. In some towns there were church schools where Latin was taught, but for the rural poor, letters were as foreign as falcons. Children learned by watching. A boy learned to reap by watching his father's swing. A girl learned to spin by watching her mother's fingers. No lectures, no lessons, only repetition. And when the child asked why wool had to be spun, or why the bread had to be made every day, the answer was simple: because that is what is done. The seasons the only clock. The rhythm of the year for a medieval villager was set not by calendar pages, but by what the fields demanded. Spring meant plowing and sowing. The ground was cold and often still wet, but it had to be turned. Oxen were scarce and shared, so neighbors cooperated. Arguments often broke out. Still, the fields got planted. Summer meant weeding, scything, chasing pests. It was backbreaking work from sunup to sundown. There were no holidays. There was no break. Every weed missed was a grain lost. Autumn was harvest. This was both the busiest and most communal time. Entire villages worked together. The Lord's grain came first always, then your own. Winter was both rest and fear. The days were short. The food was never enough. Wood was scarce. The wind was unforgiving. Illness came more easily. But also, winter was when people mended, spun, told stories, and tried to believe they'd survive to see barley sprout again. There was no escape from the cycle, only the hope that this year would be no worse than the last. Feast days, the same but different. The church provided the only real variation in the year. Saints' days, feast days, and fasts dotted the calendar. They were the medieval version of holidays, though they rarely meant true rest. On feast days, the church bell rang longer. Mass was attended. Occasionally, food was shared, ale poured, meat roasted, laughter permitted. Weddings were often timed around these days. So were fairs, where merchants came with things never seen before: iron pots, ribbons, glass beads. On those days, a child might taste honey, a woman might hear music, a man might see a juggler. And then the next day, it was back to the field. Feast days didn't relieve the boredom, they highlighted it. The church, not comfort but constancy. Religion was not questioned. God was as real as the mud beneath your door. The village priest was often the only person who could read. He owned the largest building, the church, and reminded you weekly of your duties: tithe, confession, obedience, humility. You didn't understand Latin. You didn't need to. The rituals were enough. You touched holy water, you crossed yourself. You knelt on cold stone, you chanted when told. Your life was suffering. The next would be better, that was the promise. Heaven was rest. This world was work. The priest rarely smiled. His sermons were not entertaining, but he kept records. He married you. He buried your children. He was there. That in the end was enough. The Lord's manor, a world apart. The local Lord did not live among you. His manor was on a hill, or at least behind a wall. You owed him rent, grain, animals, labor. You owed him loyalty and sometimes your children as servants. But you rarely saw him. The manor was its own world. Larger fires, better bread, tapestries on walls, plates made of metal, not wood. The reeve or bailiff came instead. He collected, he judged, he reminded you who owned the land you walked on. Rebellion was unthinkable, even questioning was rare. The system had been the same for generations. Still, at the edge of the village, where the fields met the woods, people whispered, not of revolution but of lords who were kinder, of rents that were lower elsewhere, of distant lands. Nothing changed, but sometimes people dreamed. The market, one day to see the world. Once a week or once a month, depending on your location, a nearby town would hold market. If you were fortunate, or if your chores allowed, you might go. You walked, of course, hours sometimes, along rutted paths through cold fog over worn bridges. You arrived with a hen, a woven basket, a handful of eggs. There you saw things you didn't have names for, spices that burned your tongue, cloth dyed colors you didn't know existed, people who spoke differently, men with coins, women without veils, foreigners with strange shoes. You traded or watched others do so. You stared. You listened. You held on to the image of the juggler tossing flaming sticks in the air. And then you walked home. The next day the pigs still needed slop. The tunic still itched. But you remembered the smell of roasted nuts, just for a moment. Dreams that went nowhere. If you had a dream of travel, of freedom, of doing something other than pulling weeds, you told no one. Dreams weren't practical, they weren't safe, you might be laughed at. A boy who dreamed of joining a monastery might never leave the village. A girl who wished to see the sea would marry a man from the next hamlet instead. Still, the dreams were there. In the scratch marks on a wooden beam, in the songs hummed while spinning, in the small sketches made with coal on a cottage wall. But mostly, dreams stayed quiet, like everything else. An unresolved question. When the world demands repetition, and each day offers nothing new, is hope something you create or something you inherit? For the most part, a 14th century peasant's life was built to repeat. Days rolled over like damp cloth being folded and refolded. You ate the same food, wore the same clothes, said the same prayers. It was a life of subtle endurance, boring, yes, but deeply rooted. But sometimes even the slowest, most uneventful lives were touched by change. It wasn't always violent. It wasn't always visible. But it was always noticed because in a world of sameness, even a small shift felt enormous. What happened when the rhythm was disrupted not by choice, but by external forces that didn't ask for permission? The first signs, whispers from afar. It might begin with something as small as a rumor. A traveler at market speaks of a distant town where half the people have vanished. A friar shares a sermon with new urgency in his voice. A merchant refuses to shake hands. At first, no one changes their routine. The fields are still there. The sheep still need shearing. But the air feels different. The bread is blander. The prayers are longer. Something is wrong, and no one can name it. Then a neighbor's child becomes ill. Then his brother. Then his mother. The silence in the village deepens. The arrival of the plague. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348. But before the rats and the coughing and the ringing of bells, there was confusion. Your neighbor disappears. The priest stops visiting homes. The bell in the chapel rings for funerals and rings again and again. The symptoms are quick: fever, swelling, darkness under the arms, on the neck, behind the knees. You recognize the pattern because it repeats. Some flee. They run into the woods or head for distant relatives. Others stay. They believe it is God's punishment. They fast, they confess, they pray more. And still the coughing continues. The church fills with moans, then empties. Your family stays inside more often. The door is barred, the fire burns low, meals are skipped, no one jokes. Even the lice seem quieter. When the village stops moving, the silence that once defined rural life becomes suffocating. There are no animals in the lanes, no footfalls at dawn. The mill wheel has stopped turning. The reeve no longer comes to collect rent. The Lord has not been seen for days. The people who were always there always, every day are simply not. There is no formal announcement, no warning bell. You simply wake up one day and find that half the cottages are cold. For a moment, you think this must be what the end of time feels like. But then the sun rises, as it always does. You go outside and dig up a turnip. After, a new kind of quiet. Eventually, the death slows. No one says it's over. No one dares. You look around and realize there are fewer people than ever before. The fields are overgrown. Sheep wander untended. The baker's oven is cold. And yet your family has survived. You begin to clean, to mend, to plant again. But something has changed. The rhythm has broken. The same day no longer returns. You live in a space that feels both empty and enormous. There is no one to fill it. You walk past abandoned cottages. The doors swing open in the breeze. Inside, pots still hang over dead fires. Straw beds are matted and sunlit. You remember who lived there. You remember their names. And then you keep walking. Shifting power when the labor could ask. With so many gone, the balance of power shifts not with rebellion, but with opportunity. The Lord still owns the land, yes, but now he has no one to farm it, no one to shear his sheep, no one to pay rent. He needs people, and you are people. Suddenly your labor has value. The Lord may offer better terms, lower rent, a piglet for your family, a strip of better land. You, who once had no choice, now have some. It is not revolution, but it is new. And with each small concession, your days feel a little different. The lure of the town. For the first time, some people leave. They go to towns where work is rumored to pay coin. They become apprentices, millers, even merchants, assistants. You hear stories of men from villages like yours now wearing shoes every day, eating cheese more than once a week. They send letters dictated to scribes, since they can't write themselves. Some of them never return. Others come back with strange accents and money in small leather pouches. You wonder what the town smells like, what it sounds like at night. But you stay. The cottage still needs tending. The fields, though wild, are not hopeless. And you are still here. Memory as inheritance. Years pass. Children grow. Cottages are repaired. The reeve comes again, older, slower, less certain. The old routine returns, but it's never quite the same. The boredom, once comforting, now carries echoes. You pluck a chicken and remember your mother's hands doing the same. You bake bread and recall the year there was no flour. You mend a tunic and see a missing brother's face. Memory is no longer just remembrance, it's a duty, a map, a warning. The stories of the plague are told quietly, not with drama but with weight. They are sewn into lullabies, whispered during chores, breathed into the walls. And the children listen. What endures? Despite everything, many things return to their place. The fire is still built each morning. The wool still itches. The church bell still marks the hours. The seasons still march, muddy and golden and cold. You still walk to market. You still kneel in the chapel. You still share a bowl of pottage with your children. And when you scratch at the sleeve of your tunic, you smile just a little. Because it means you're still here. A final reflection. We often think of history as the story of kings, conquests, and plagues. But in truth, most of it happens in small cottages, under low roofs, around fires that go out too easily. It happens in the daily repetition of the same task. The itch of wool, the cracking of bread, the hush after the bell rings. And when great change comes, it's these small, boring patterns that tell us whether a people endured or simply vanished. If boredom is what survives when the world falls apart, then maybe it isn't so boring after all. Story 3. A Roman centurion's breakfast, spoiled barley and cold shoes. You are in the Roman Empire. Not in the marble-clad heart of Rome, but far from it on the frontier, somewhere in northern Gaul or Britain, near the edge of where the empire still pretends it's in control. The year is 117 CE, and you are a centurion, not a senator, not an emperor. You command men, yes, but mostly you watch them dig. You enforce discipline. You eat badly. This isn't the Rome of epic battles or grand speeches. This is the dull, daily life of a mid-ranking officer who wakes up too early, eats the same barley mash every day, and spends more time inspecting sandals than leading charges. This is a soldier's life, without the poetry. Let us begin, then, with the morning trumpet bucina that calls you to a breakfast not worth waking up for. The barracks, damp stone and always loud. Your room is small. You have your own, unlike the common soldiers who share long dormitories. But it's still just a stone cell with a wooden bed, a blanket that stinks of vinegar and sweat, and a straw-filled mattress that's too short. The walls are bare. A dented bronze helmet hangs on a peg. A sword belt droops from a hook. A wax tablet rests on a shelf, cracked at the corner. Nothing decorative. Everything is functional. You sleep in your tunic because it's cold. You wear your caligy, heavy-soled sandals, inside because the floor is damp, and you've had enough of waking to find rats chewing the edges of your foot wraps. The bucina sounds. You don't jump up. You've been awake. You always are. You slept with one ear tuned for trouble, not because you expect enemies, but because your men might have been drunk again. You sit up, stretch, and wince at the same pain in your shoulder you've had since Germania. A centurion's privilege, slightly less bad food. You walk outside into the cold morning air. It smells like wet stone, sheep, and sour wine. The legion's camp is alive with noise. Cloaks swish, metal clinks, Latin curses echo off the stone walls. You don't eat with the legionaries. Their meal is barley gruel, watery and laced with bitterness from whatever herb the cook tossed in. They line up with bowls, muttering. You nod at them. They don't speak unless you speak first. You eat in the officers' quarters. The Principia has its own small kitchen. Your breakfast is not much better, but there's some olive oil on it. The bread is yesterday's and already hard. The cheese is sharp enough to start a fight, but it's warm and you sit while you eat. That alone makes you luckier than 90% of the men. You sip watered-down wine. Your lips are cracked. You do not complain. Your boots are damp again. Morning duties, checking, not marching. As a centurion, you don't spend most of your time fighting. You manage. You walk the lines of the camp. You inspect the palisades. You nod at guards. You stop at the latrines and make a note of the smell. It's bad again. You'll have to assign men to dig them out. You visit the tabularium, the records office. The clerk is already scratching away. There are lists to check: grain deliveries, punishment records, leather rations. You initial a tablet. You don't remember what it says. You'll sign another 20 by noon. A soldier approaches. His sword is rusted. You bark at him. He nods, ashamed. He will be on latrine duty tomorrow. This is command. The shoes that never fit. You remember your first pair of caligy, hobnailed military sandals issued the day you joined. You wore them for 20 years. They never fit. No one's did. They were made to last, not to comfort. The thick leather straps cut into your ankles when wet and hardened like iron when dry. You learned to stuff moss into them during winter. You still do. Now, as a centurion, you're entitled to a slightly better pair, but they're still just shoes that break your feet differently. You keep them oiled. You check the nails weekly. You once saw a man crippled from a nail that bent inside and pierced the sole of his foot. He limped for the rest of his life. He died in a grain riot, not in battle. Shoes matter. Training without purpose. You gather your men in the training yard, not for war but for drill. Always drill. The same formations, the same maneuvers: shields up, advance, rotate, fall back. They groan, but they do it. Discipline is everything. If a man can't hold his shield straight after 5 hours, how will he hold the line in a skirmish? You don't expect war today, or tomorrow. The last real battle was 3 years ago, and even then it was a skirmish against some bored raiders. But you train anyway. Rome expects order. You correct a young recruit's stance. He flinches. You remember flinching like that. Letters from nowhere. At midday, you return to your quarters. You wash your hands in a bucket of cold water. You chew on dried figs and hard cheese. A messenger hands you a folded wax tablet. It's a letter from someone in Hispania. You squint at the script. It's from your brother or your cousin, you're not sure anymore. He writes about a bad harvest, a cousin marrying, a nephew sick. You fold it, you don't write back. The scribe charges too much. And what would you say? I woke early. I ate spoiled barley. I told a man to polish his armor. There is nothing new. An afternoon of forms and fines. You spend the afternoon reviewing penalties. A soldier caught sleeping on guard duty, a fight over dice, a dented shield, a missing cloak. Each has a punishment, extra duties, reduced rations, a flogging. You don't enjoy it, but it's necessary. The army is not a place for softness. It's a machine, and each cog must know its place. You write notes, you summon men, you speak without raising your voice. A centurion does not shout often. When he does, it means something. You fine a man 2 denarii for insulting another's mother. They both grin after. It's a familiar joke. One of them cried last night in the latrines. You pretend not to know. Evening parade and the cold again. At dusk, the camp gathers. The watch schedule is announced. Rations are distributed. Orders from above, rarely interesting, are read aloud. You stand at attention. Your armor catches the last of the sun. After you dismiss the men, they scatter to barracks, kitchens, corners. You walk slowly to your room. Your shoulders ache. You remove your chest plate carefully. You sit on your cot, stare at the flickering oil lamp, and chew a strip of salted meat. It tastes like leather, and not in a good way. Thoughts before sleep. You lie down in the same tunic you wore yesterday. Your legs are sore. You think about home, wherever that is now. Maybe a vineyard, maybe a street with no mud, maybe a girl who didn't wait. You don't remember her name. You trace the scar on your forearm. It's not from war, it's from falling down wet stairs in the barracks. Your boots are drying by the door. They'll still be damp tomorrow. You fall asleep to the sound of rats and the wind against stone. An unresolved question. When every day is built on routines, orders, and barley, what does a soldier dream of if he dares to dream at all? A Roman centurion's life may have seemed prestigious in scrolls and speeches, but out on the frontier, it was defined more by dust than by glory. You were supposed to command, but in reality, much of your command was over ditches, inventories, and the discipline of men who didn't want to be there in the first place. We descend into the long and uneventful midday hours. The maintenance of roads, construction of forts, the endless digging, repairing, and reorganizing of a military machine that was always more concerned with being prepared than with being inspired. You didn't lead conquests, you led carpentry. You kept order not with blood but with boredom. The midday tasks, Rome runs on sweat. You don't plan your day. It was planned for you by the empire, by your superior officer, or by yesterday's problems. Today, you're overseeing the repair of a vallum, the defensive ditch that surrounds the camp. It has collapsed in one section. The dirt is too wet. Someone dug it too shallow last season. You don't dig it yourself, but you stand there for hours watching others do it. You correct posture. You check the angle of the slope. You order a soldier to sharpen the shovel blade using a worn grindstone. It's hot now. The same wool tunic that froze you this morning now soaks with sweat. You wear a leather neck protector to keep from burning. It chafes. The sun has climbed, but not fast enough. Time lingers. The ditch deepens. You scratch at your shoulder. The lice are back. You make a note to have your bedding scraped again. Supervision as a skill. Centurions are not commanders in the way poets imagine them. You're more of a project manager with a gladius. You lead about 80 men a century, though the number rarely matches the name due to illness, desertion, or miscounts. You assign watches. You oversee construction. You inspect cloaks and make sure the dice games don't turn violent. You also settle disputes. One soldier claims another stole his cooking pot. You listen. You nod. You find them both. You make them share latrine duty for a week. You're not cruel, but you are consistent. That is more important than fairness. Your soldiers both fear and appreciate you. They grumble when you pass. They stop grumbling when you turn. The construction that never ends. You build everything. Rome does not believe in hearing locals or letting soldiers rest. When you're not at war, you build. You build roads. You build walls. You build camps, bridges, watchtowers, storage sheds, and bakeries. The empire is held together, not just by laws, but by masonry and ditches. You carry wooden stakes. You dig post holes. You haul lime and mix mortar. Even when you stop moving, the sound of picks and shovels continues. The smell of sweat, clay, and pine sap is everywhere. You once oversaw the construction of a bathhouse. It took 2 years. You never used it. Letters from Rome you'll never answer. Once a month, the provincial governor sends instructions. They are long. They are written in formal Latin, using words that sound impressive and say nothing. You read them slowly. You translate them aloud for your clerk. You hand him a reply to transcribe. Orders received. Construction proceeding. That's all they want to hear. The governor will not visit. He may not even know where you are. Still, you use a clean stylus when signing his name. The pretense must be maintained. Meal 2, the same as meal 1. Around the 8th hour, your stomach reminds you it's time for the second meal. You return to your quarters. Someone brings you more barley mash. It's slightly less watery than this morning's. There's a bit of garlic in it. Luxury. You chew, you swallow. You don't taste it. A crust of bread. A small cup of wine, more water than wine. It tastes like wood and vinegar. It keeps the thirst away. You used to dream of better meals. Now you hope your next one is exactly the same. No surprises, no sickness, no excitement. Evening orders and daily punishments. After meal 2, you prepare for the evening decuria, the division of night watches. You assign shifts. You note who's due for patrol duty. You dock a man's pay for missing a shift yesterday. Then the punishments begin. One soldier shows up drunk. He cannot stand straight. You order him lashed, not severely, just enough to teach. 2 men fight over a tunic. You make them run laps around the camp in full gear. 1 man lied about the grain weight. You shave his head. No one complains. Discipline keeps them alive, or so you remind yourself. You log each punishment in the wax tablet. You sign your name carefully. A record may one day be read by someone who cares. Your men, the ones who stay and the ones who disappear. Some soldiers you've known for years. You know their coughs, their gaits, their smells. Others are new, replacements sent from the south. They blend in eventually, or they don't. You remember one who sang at night. Beautiful voice. Gone now, transferred or killed or simply vanished. Another who used to mend boots for everyone. He hanged himself last spring. No note. You burned his kit. You don't ask why anymore. You don't say their names unless required. Still, you remember their faces. That is your weakness. The dead work hardest. There's a graveyard just outside the camp walls. Small, orderly stones mark the fallen. Some died from wounds, some from fever, some from sheer misfortune, a collapsing wall, a startled horse. The graves are dug by the men themselves. You supervise the spacing. You've buried friends, subordinates, strangers. You always write their names. When known, When not, you write Millet's ignoti unknown soldier. Sometimes, you look at the graves and wonder how many more stones will carry your handwriting. You don't think about your own. You plan to die in a bed, someday, somewhere with olive trees. You know you won't. Nightfall, the briefest respite. The sun finally drops behind the trees. The camp glows with torchlight. The air smells different, now cooler, tinged with cooked beans and burning wood. You sit on a bench outside your quarters. You rub your neck. You loosen your belt. You listen to the muted chatter from the barracks. You do not speak. The stars come out. You recognize constellations. You name them in Greek, then Latin. You don't remember what they meant anymore. You walk to the edge of the palisade. You look out into the dark. There's nothing there. There never is. Still, you stand a while. Just in case. A letter you never send. You pick up a scrap of parchment. You dip the pen. You hesitate. You think of writing to someone back home, your sister, maybe. Or the boy who used to follow you through the markets in Capua. You begin salve. Then you stop. There's nothing worth saying. Nothing new, just more of the same. You put the parchment away. Tomorrow the ditch needs to be widened. Someone will forget their watch. The barley will taste like old feet. Your boots will still be wet. An unresolved question. If your entire life is spent in preparation for a fight that may never come, does that preparation become its own kind of battle? You join the legions for glory, not riches, not really, and not power. You wanted a name that would live longer than your bones. You were told Rome would remember its soldiers, that bravery would be etched in bronze, that victory was a kind of immortality. Instead, you were issued barley and wet sandals. We examine how the career of a Roman centurion rarely ended in song. You trained men who didn't want to be trained. You enforced discipline in a place where nothing happened. You prepared for wars that never came, or when they did, arrived late in mud and silence. Your end was not a crescendo. It was a slow unraveling of duty, routine, and joints. And as you aged in a camp you never chose, Rome itself became more of an idea than a place. The campaign that was. The orders arrived in spring, a campaign at last. There had been rumors barbarian tribes stirring north of the border, raids along the river, scouts disappearing into forests that once seemed tame. The soldiers whispered about glory. You did not. You'd seen campaigns. They began with muddy wheels and broken bridges. They ended with frostbite and bad pay. Still you prepared. The men cleaned their armor, spears were inspected, rations were increased, letters were sent to families or to no one. Then nothing. A second message arrived. The enemy had moved. There would be no advance, just patrols, defensive operations, maybe next year. You nodded. You rolled the scroll and handed it to your clerk. You ordered the men to resume road repairs. They grumbled, you didn't. You returned to your quarters and scraped mold from your sandals. Retirement that never feels earned. You were promised retirement after 25 years, a plot of land, a pension, a quiet life near a village that served wine instead of orders. Now you are 46. You've served 28 years. Your paperwork was submitted last winter. It has not returned. You are still here. You've stopped asking. Your commander tells you it's delayed administrative confusion in Rome, new taxes, political change, the usual. You still train the men, still sign the punishment records, still eat the same barley. You used to count the days. Now you count the men who have come and gone under your watch. You wonder if you'll die with a pension still pending. The body that doesn't march. Your knees ache, always. You carry a cane now not for show, but because standing for more than an hour turns your spine into a scream. You hide it around the young soldiers, but they know. They carry heavier loads when you're near, some out of respect, others from pity. You still wear your armor, but only for parades. The cuirass is heavier than you remember. The belt bruises your hips. You breathe slower now. You once ran 5 miles in full gear. Now, you need to sit after climbing stairs. There are no medals, no honors. Just stiffness, and the strange realization that your body is the last thing still loyal to Rome. The new recruits who don't know the old songs. You watch the new boys arrive barely men. Some are local auxiliaries, barely speaking Latin. Others are citizens, assigned by lottery or desperation. They don't know the chants. They grip their swords like tools, not weapons. They flinch at night noises. They question orders. You teach them anyway, not because they deserve it, but because the machine must keep running. You demonstrate a shield formation. Your voice cracks halfway through. One of the recruits snickers. You make him dig a trench until dusk. You tell them stories of Germania, of the river crossing, of your friend Cassius who fought with a spear in his ribs. They don't listen. That's fine. You weren't listening at their age either. The letter that finally comes. One morning, a runner arrives with a scroll. It is your retirement approval. You break the seal with numb fingers. The letter is short. You are granted a parcel of land near Arles. You may travel there at your own expense. A pension of grain and coin will follow when available. You fold it, you place it beside your armor. You do not smile. That night you drink with the other centurions. They raise their cups, they clap your back. One of them weeps, he's not sure why. You drink slowly, you feel nothing. The next morning, you begin packing. Leaving the camp, one step at a time. You walk the grounds one last time. You nod to the guards. You tap the post you carved your initials into during your first year. The gates open for you. No fanfare, no trumpet, just the creak of old wood and the sound of your sandals on dry earth. You carry a bag. You wear your sword not out of pride, but because it's habit. The sun is behind you. Ahead lies a road, dusty, cracked, slightly uphill. You do not look back. You simply walk. A plot of land with no olive trees. The land is small, rocky, near a village that speaks a dialect you barely understand. The house is made of mud bricks, the roof leaks. Still, it is yours. You spend days repairing the fence. You barter for hens. You plant bitter greens and hope for rain. At night, you sit outside and listen to the wind. You wear plain clothes now. Your armor stays under the bed, covered in cloth. Children point at you. Some ask if you were ever in a battle. You say yes. You don't explain. Sometimes you see young men drilling in the town square. Their shields wobble. Their shoes squeak. You don't say a word. No one remembers the ditches. You know the forts you helped build still stand, at least some of them. You know roads you supervised are still traveled. But no one writes songs about ditches. No statues are carved of men who assigned guard duty or enforced hygiene. Still, the roads carry trade. The forts protect travelers. The grain gets taxed. That is your monument. It is invisible and permanent. An aging centurion's final reflection. You rise early even now. You eat the same breakfast, barley warmed with oil. You water your garden, you clean your sandals. Old habits never die. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, you miss the sound of the trumpet, not because it called you to glory, but because it gave the day a shape. Now you shape the day yourself. There is no empire to salute, no record keeper to impress, no punishment list to sign. Only the wind, the soil, and the creaking of your knees. You are not bored, you are not content. You are simply still alive. And in the end, perhaps that is the only victory the empire ever truly offered. A final thought. If history remembers only the victories and the emperors, who remembers the hands that built the victory's walls, drilled the troops, and kept the wine flowing in silence? Story 4. Waiting for mail in 1803, a history of tedious delays. In the year 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte was busy rebuilding the French Empire. The United States had just finalized the Louisiana Purchase. Somewhere in Prussia, a philosopher was scribbling new ideas about reason and freedom. But you were waiting for a letter. This story is not about the men who changed history, but the thousands who sat by the fire, checked the road, stared at the empty horizon, and waited for words that might not come. A love letter, a bill, a military order, a warning, or just news from a brother who said he'd write before the harvest. This is the story of mail when it was slow, unreliable, and sometimes the most exciting thing to happen in a month. And the slowness wasn't an accident. It was the system. The post road, rut, mud, and reluctance. You live in the English countryside, in a stone cottage 2 miles from the nearest town. The road outside is more a suggestion than infrastructure, a dirt path full of ruts that become miniature ponds in the rain, which is often. In theory, post riders travel this road once a week. In practice, once every 2 weeks, weather permitting. The mail comes by horse, always horse. One rider, sometimes two, burdened with satchels full of parchment and folded letters, sweating through coats crusted in mud. If the horse is injured, the mail doesn't come. If a river floods, the mail doesn't come. If the rider gets drunk in the next town, the mail doesn't come. You watch the road daily. Most days, nothing passes except a dog. Still, you check. How long does a letter take in 1803? If someone in London posts a letter to you, say, a distance of 150 miles, it will arrive in 10 days if you're lucky. 14 days more likely. Never if it rains, if the road washes out, or if the carrier loses interest. Mail was not guaranteed. The letter must first be collected at a local station, carried to a sorting house, stamped, and then held until a carrier departs in the right direction. If the person writing you doesn't prepay postage, and many didn't, you'll have to pay for the delivery when it arrives. The postman will stand at your door, wet and annoyed, until you hand him the fee. If you have no coin, he takes it back. The stationer's desk, a waiting room for news. Sometimes you go into town, just to check with the stationer who doubles as the postmaster. He's a hunched man with ink-stained fingers who knows more gossip than the priest. You enter the shop. It smells of dust and damp paper. He rifles through the wooden pigeonholes behind the desk. He shakes his head. Nothing yet. You ask if he's sure. He grunts. He's always sure. You browse the envelopes pinned on the wall, ones no one has claimed. You don't touch them. You never do. Outside, the rain starts again. The letter you're waiting for. Maybe it's from your cousin in London. He was supposed to send money for your daughter's wedding. Or perhaps it's from your son, stationed with the army in Dublin. Or perhaps it's from the solicitor regarding that land dispute. Or maybe it's a love letter. A single sheet folded into itself, sealed with wax. The wax will be smudged by the time it reaches you. The writing barely legible, but you'll hold it like treasure. You rehearse what it might say. You imagine the opening, "My dearest," or perhaps, "I write to inform you," or simply, "Sir." You imagine the closing, "Ever yours," or "In haste with affection." You imagine everything except silence. The village grapevine, letters read aloud. When mail finally arrives, you don't always get privacy. In smaller towns, people gather at the tavern or the church steps, reading letters aloud, especially for those who can't read. A neighbor might read your letter before you do. They mean no harm. That's just how it works. Some letters are opened slowly, as if the wax holds back secrets. Others are torn open and read with trembling hands. News of death, birth, or taxes. You sit nearby, pretending not to listen. Still, you hope to hear your name. Still nothing. The courier who forgets you exist. The post rider is not a loyal servant of your imagination. He does not care about your hopes. He does not know about the urgency of your reply. He is a man on a tired horse, soaked to the bone, carrying 400 letters through wind, sleet, and the occasional thrown stone. He remembers cities, towns, big names. He forgets farms, he forgets you. Even if your letter is in his bag, he may drop it off at the tavern and hope someone else will carry it the rest of the way. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it rains, and the letter dissolves. Mail theft, a quiet epidemic. If your letter goes missing, you might suspect theft. It wouldn't be uncommon. Some carriers open letters and pocket coin meant for relatives. Others read the letters for amusement. Some simply throw out stacks of mail rather than finish their route. There are reports of postboys selling letters with romantic contents to local gossips, or altering the words, or forging replies. If your letter is particularly important, you might hire a private courier, but that costs more than a month's wages. So you wait. You imagine the letter was never sent, that it sits in a drawer somewhere, that the ink has faded, that the person who wrote it no longer remembers your name. Weather, the final enemy. In winter, the mail barely moves. Snow piles in drifts taller than horses, roads vanish, rivers freeze. In your home, you sit near the hearth, feeding it damp wood, and wonder if the letter is trapped in a bag under a collapsed bridge. By spring, you will have stopped expecting it. That is when it will finally arrive creased, dirt-stained, and smelling faintly of musty wool. You'll open it with shaking hands. It will say, "We write to inform you that the issue has been resolved." No explanation, no apology. You'll fold it again and place it in a drawer. The mind fills the silence. While you wait, your mind invents stories. You imagine your son too busy to write because he's been promoted, or because he's ill, or married. You imagine the solicitor forgot, or that your cousin fell from a carriage, or that the letter was sent to the wrong farm. The silence becomes a character in your life. You speak to it. You say, "Maybe tomorrow." And silence says nothing back. An unresolved question. When waiting becomes a way of life, and silence tells you more than speech ever could, how do you know when to stop listening? Waiting for the mail was more than a personal frustration, it was an entire infrastructure of slowness, a deeply bureaucratic ballet of wagons, horses, ink, and routine. In this section, we turn our gaze toward the machinery behind the silence, the stations, clerks, stamps, mistakes, and human bottlenecks that made communication in 1803 both possible and maddening. You are not alone in your waiting. Across Europe and America, across muddy hamlets and crowded cities, men and women held their breath for news. And behind every unopened letter was a long trail of delays, missteps, and the simple fact that mail, like most things in history, was boring by design. The sorting office, where delay becomes policy. In any major city, London, Paris, Boston, the central post office was not a cathedral of communication. It was a warehouse. Inside, a dim, smoky room filled with sorting tables, ink pots, and men hunched over parchment. Letters were dumped from bags and sifted by destination. Some were marked by hand, others with wooden stamps pounded until the table shook. Each item had to be logged. Some were charged by weight, others by number of enclosures, still others by origin or recipient status. There were no envelopes. Letters were folded sheets of paper sealed with wax or glue, often bearing multiple addresses if forwarded through various towns. If a clerk misplaced a letter, no one knew. If he forgot to mark it as paid, it might be returned. If he simply dropped it behind a table, it might stay there for years. The system didn't fail because it was malicious. It failed because it was dull. And no one loved the dull more than a government clerk. The postal riders, heroes of the unremarkable. They were not gallant, not romantic, not uniformed figures galloping through danger. They were often older men, sometimes teenagers, paid poorly, expected to endure everything. Their horses were usually old. Their coats were usually threadbare. They were expected to carry letters, parcels, notices, and occasionally passengers. They rode between way stations posting inns where they could change horses, rest briefly, or wait for days for the next delivery. Delays weren't unusual, they were expected. Sometimes the roads were impassable. Sometimes bandits stole the bags. Sometimes, during wartime, the mail was confiscated or censored. You might hand your letter to a post rider with hope in your heart, only for it to die in his satchel beside a moldy apple. Still they rode, because even a boring job is a job. The fee table, a slow wall of confusion. Mail wasn't free, it wasn't even predictable. Fees were calculated by distance, weight, size, number of enclosures, whether the sender prepaid or not, whether the recipient was known to default on payment. Rates changed with political shifts. War meant higher tariffs, peace meant confusing reductions. Colonies were sometimes included in standard rates, sometimes not. You could send a letter for tuppence one month and sixpence the next, depending on whether the postal route crossed a newly taxed bridge or if the rider's horse had to be fed more often. If you didn't pay, your recipient would. If neither did, the letter would be returned to the station, marked refused, then shelved or destroyed. There was no system for refunds, no appeals, no tracking numbers. The price of a message was not just coin but patience, luck, and a willingness to be confused. Delays by design, mail as a low priority. In 1803, nations were focused on everything except mail. France was reorganizing under Napoleon. Britain was bracing for another round of conflict. The United States was trying to sort out how much land it had just bought. Mail wasn't a state priority, it was a nuisance. Budgets were tight, routes were inconsistent, maps were often inaccurate. Mail coaches shared roads with livestock, carts, and refugees. In cities, streets were unnamed or recently renamed. In villages, houses lacked numbers entirely. Delivery might involve asking around. Do you know someone named Jacob who might be expecting a letter? If no one knew Jacob, the letter was carried onward or not. In many places, the post was tied to military dispatches. Civilian letters were secondary cargo. You might write a heartfelt letter on Monday, but it wouldn't even be noticed by an official until Thursday. And that was a good week. War mail, the dullest of casualties. 1803 marked the end of the brief Peace of Amiens and the beginning of war between Britain and France. Again. War mail was supposed to be prioritized. In practice, it was disrupted, lost, or censored. Soldiers sent letters via military couriers when possible, but often relied on civilians or passing merchants. Entire battalions might move before their mail caught up. A letter could travel for weeks and finally arrive at a camp, only to find the recipient had died 3 days prior. No one would forward the letter. It might be returned. It might be burned. Most likely it would be forgotten. Families waited for news. Wives clutched outdated updates. Children memorized the handwriting of fathers they'd never meet. For many, mail became a slow process of grieving long before the death was confirmed. Forgery, false news, and the spread of mistakes. Not all mail was real. In an age without mass printing or standardized forms, anyone with ink and skill could write an official letter. Forgery spread rumors, taxes changing, armies arriving, relatives dying. Some were jokes, others were scams. Even genuine letters could contain errors, misremembered names, unclear directions, broken seals. You might receive a letter telling you that your uncle in York had died only to find weeks later he was fine, and had sent a similar notice about you. The mail created as much confusion as clarity. And the confusion took longer to correct than to create. The experience of not knowing. The hardest part of waiting wasn't the silence. It was not knowing what the silence meant. Had the letter been sent? Had it been lost? Had it been stolen? Had it arrived and been rejected? Had it said something you didn't want to hear and someone destroyed it? The human mind filled in blanks. Some assumed the worst, others assumed nothing. Meanwhile, the letter might be sitting in a pouch under a pile of hay, in a stable, next to a postal inn where the writer had fallen asleep drunk. Or it might never have existed at all. The letters that changed nothing. When letters finally arrived, they rarely delivered drama. Instead, a brother thanked you for a recipe. A clerk confirmed a transaction from months ago. A cousin sent news of a wedding you'd already missed. The letter was folded, the seal was cracked, the ink bled from rain. And the words were predictable, faded. You read them twice anyway. You held the paper like it mattered. Because in a world of unending wait, the letter was the closest thing to movement. Even when it said nothing new. Paper piled in forgotten places. Old letters gathered in boxes, drawers, baskets. They were kept not because they were beautiful, but because they had arrived, each one a small victory over distance and delay. They smelled like dust and damp wool. Some had dates, others had no names. Some were never opened. But each had weight. Each was the memory of a hand that moved across paper, and a road that was crossed, however slowly. Even if the words were meaningless, the presence of the page proved that something once moved between you and someone else. And that was enough. An unresolved question. When news always arrives late, and truth is always uncertain, does the act of waiting become more meaningful than the message itself? By now, the letter you've been waiting for might have arrived, or it might never arrive at all. You've stopped checking the road every morning. You've stopped asking the stationer. You've stopped rehearsing what the letter might say. But the waiting remains. It lingers in the quiet moments. It curls like smoke around the fire. You're no longer sure if you want the letter to arrive or if the waiting itself has become the comfort. We reflect on the meaning of mail not just as a tool of communication, but as a ritual of hope, a habit of imagination, and a monument to the long, slow patience of ordinary people. We'll explore what people did when the letter did come, and what they did when it didn't. Because most of the time, it didn't. When the letter finally arrived. Let's say the letter finally comes. The postman, unceremonious as always, hands it to you without looking up. He wipes rain from his brow and says nothing. The letter is cold, damp at the edges, folded twice, wax seal mostly intact. You run your thumb along the fold. Inside 2 paragraphs, ink slightly smudged. The handwriting is familiar but rushed. There are no flourishes, no promises. It reads, "Dear Sir, I regret the delay in writing. Matters have changed. The sum will not be forwarded. Please consider the situation closed. Yours, R. Devereux." That's it. The money for your daughter's wedding won't come. The cousin you trusted has moved on. There is no reason given, no apology offered, no recourse suggested. And yet you exhale. Because now you know. When the letter was the wrong one. Sometimes the letter comes, but it is addressed to someone else. The postmaster shrugs. Close enough, he says. The name is similar, the village is right. You take it home anyway. You open it just to be sure. The handwriting is unfamiliar. The words are about sheep prices and a neighbor's dog. You refold it, you place it back in the envelope. You stare at it for hours. Eventually, you toss it into the fire. Not out of anger, but because it is easier to destroy someone else's letter than admit your own never came. When the letter never came at all. Most of the time, letters didn't come. People made promises they didn't keep. Soldiers died before posting their words. Merchants forgot. Lovers changed their minds. Children grew up and moved on. You stop waiting eventually, but not suddenly. You wait a little less each day. You glance at the road, but only once. You visit the stationer once a month. You stop setting aside a dry spot on the table where you used to place the letter when it came. And then one day you realize it has been a year, and you no longer expect anything. What people did instead of writing back. Many people never wrote letters at all. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, or they didn't know where to begin. If they received a letter, they might ask someone to read it aloud, then sit in silence, too ashamed or overwhelmed to dictate a reply. Some left the letter on the mantel for years, its folds softening with time. Others carried it in their coat unread, as a kind of charm. A few copied the handwriting and pretended to write back just to feel like they had. In a world where communication was rare, people learned to fill the gaps with gestures. A loaf of bread sent by cart. A coat mended and given as a gift. A candle left burning in the window. Not all messages needed ink. Letters of grief and their quiet weight. When someone died, a letter might be sent. It would be formal, plain, lacking in comfort. We regret to inform you that John Cartwright expired on the 17th instant, of fever. That's all. No mention of his favorite color, no assurance that he was at peace, no description of his final moments. But the recipient would unfold the letter and sit with it for hours, sometimes for days, sometimes forever, because the letter became the body. It was the only thing that arrived. The ritual of rereading. If you were lucky enough to receive a letter, you didn't read it once. You read it again and again and again. You studied the shape of the letters, the pressure of the pen, the slant of the lines. You tried to guess what the writer had been feeling. You noted places where words were crossed out. You imagined what had been written there first. You memorized the sentences. You folded and refolded the paper until the creases wore thin. You carried it with you. And when someone asked what it said, you recited it exactly as if it were scripture. The drawer of letters that meant something. Every house had a drawer, a box, a shelf where letters were kept. They weren't organized, they weren't cataloged, but they were sacred. Letters from sons at sea. Letters from fathers long gone. Letters from women who had moved to towns you'd never see. The letters smelled of mold, ink, and time. They were touched only during long winters or moments of doubt. They offered no solutions, but they reminded you had been thought of once. That was enough. When the silence was louder than the letter. Sometimes the absence of a letter said more than a letter ever could. No reply after your confession of love. No news after your request for help. No acknowledgement of your apology. You filled the silence with meaning. You convinced yourself they had read it and wept, or that they never read it at all, or that they meant to respond but were interrupted by war, accident, or illness. The silence became part of your story. You carried it as proof that something had mattered even if no one ever said so. The future that never arrived. Some letters were promises. I will write again soon. We will visit before winter. I will explain everything when I return. Those futures rarely came. But people waited anyway. Because the waiting was easier than accepting that the letter was the end of the story. So they left a place at the table. They swept the hearth extra clean. They looked at the road each morning. They lived their lives with one eye on the horizon. A quiet ending. Eventually, the postal system improved. Railways came, telegraphs followed, messages became faster, louder, more constant. But something was lost. The slow dignity of waiting. The intimacy of a page touched by someone far away. the ritual of unfolding news, as if it mattered more than anything. In 1803, the world moved slowly. And because of that, every word that arrived felt heavier. Every letter mattered, even the ones that said nothing. A final reflection. In a world built on slow promises, what stays with us longer, what was written, or what we imagined would be? Story 5. Medieval Dentists and the Long Silence of Rotting Teeth. You've been chewing on the left side of your mouth for almost 2 years. The right molar, your second from the back, is tender, swollen, and smells faintly of rot. When you lie down at night, the pain grows louder than the wind rattling the shutters. It hums like a dull bell inside your jaw. But you don't complain, not much. This is 14th century England. You live in a thatched cottage near a small village. You own 2 tunics, 1 spoon, and no toothbrush. There is no dental care, not in the way you think of it now. No clean gloves, no numbing gel, no dentists in white coats. There are only remedies passed down through whispers, folk medicine, and if things get desperate, a man with pliers. This is a history of teeth, or more precisely, the slow, painful decay of them, and the long, quiet suffering that accompanied the medieval mouth. You'll fall asleep to the soft crunch of a barley biscuit and the promise of another tooth loosening in the night. Tooth decay as a way of life. By modern standards, the medieval diet wasn't too sugary. There were no sodas, no processed candy. But that didn't mean your teeth were safe. You ate coarse bread, often made with flour ground between stones. Tiny bits of grit made their way into your food, wearing down enamel over time. You chewed barley, rye, and oats, all fibrous, all tough. If you were lucky, you added a bit of cheese or dried fruit. Most people in your village had worn-down teeth by their 20s. If you lived to 40, you were probably missing a few altogether. Cavities weren't rare, they just weren't called that yet. Pain was common but dull, persistent, a throb behind the eye, a pulsing in the jaw. Most people didn't know what to do about it, so they didn't do much at all. The local tooth drawer. Every town had one. He wasn't a dentist. He wasn't even a barber surgeon. He was the man brave or bored enough to own a pair of tongs. He had no formal training, just a steady grip, a thick apron, and a willingness to ignore screaming. His name might be Jeffrey, or Thomas, or Henry the Miller who pulled teeth on Thursdays. He didn't numb the area. He didn't disinfect the tools. He'd ask you to sit on a stool. He'd brace your head with one hand, and with the other he'd pull or twist or snap. If he was strong and lucky, the whole tooth came out. If not, just part of it. And you paid him anyway. Folk remedies and chewed roots. But before you saw the drawer, you'd try everything else. Your grandmother swore by cloves. You'd bite down and wait for the numbness. The local healer gave you willow bark, chewed, brewed, or boiled. A mild salicylate, it eased pain for an hour or 2. Some claimed crushed garlic helped. Others favored wine-soaked rags pressed to the gums. In desperation, you might tie a toad skin to your wrist, wear a jawbone around your neck, or sleep with a sprig of rosemary under your pillow. If you were religious, you prayed to Saint Apollonia, patron saint of toothaches. She had hers torn out, so she understood. None of it worked for long. But sometimes the belief was stronger than the pain. What a bad tooth smelled like. It wasn't just the pain. The smell could be worse. A rotting tooth gave off a scent, musty, metallic, slightly sweet. It lingered on the breath in the back of the throat. People turned their heads when you spoke. You learned to mumble. Some teeth oozed, others cracked and bled. Abscesses formed beneath the gum, hot, hard lumps that made speaking difficult and swallowing worse. Infected teeth could drain for weeks, pus mixed with spit. You wiped it on your sleeve. You avoided smiling, not because you were unhappy, but because it hurt too much. Tooth loss in social life. In a small village, people knew whose mouth was failing. Your uncle was down to 6 teeth. The baker's daughter had none. Children teased those who whistled when they spoke. You adapted. You tore bread into wet chunks before chewing. You avoided apples. You gave up on meat unless it was boiled for hours. You didn't speak unless you had to. Conversations were shorter. You learned to live inside your own thoughts. And that silence over time grew into a kind of quiet dignity, the stoicism of the aching. Tooth death could be real death. If an abscess spread too far into the jawbone, the throat, the bloodstream, it could kill you. But no one called it sepsis. They said you'd been struck by fever or afflicted in the mouth. The priest might say it was penance. The swelling would increase. You'd have difficulty breathing. Your face would puff hot to the touch. Eventually, you'd stop eating. You'd take to bed. You'd drift in and out of sleep. And then silence. Sometimes, the healer would drain the swelling with a knife. But even then, survival wasn't guaranteed. Toothaches were not trivial. They were early warning signs of potential death. You learned to take them seriously, but not always quickly enough. The tools of the trade. If you ever made it to a real dentist, a barber surgeon in a city, you'd find tools that looked more like torture devices. The pelican, a curved iron tool with a hook and a blunt wedge. The tooth key, like a door key used to twist the tooth from the socket. The forceps, long-handled, crude, and often too large. All were reused, rarely cleaned, sometimes rusted. Patients were held down or tied to chairs. The barber might whistle while he worked or chant to keep time. No one expected it to be painless, only fast. The silence of the mouth. When pain became constant, speech became rare. People avoided unnecessary talk. They signaled with eyes, with hand gestures, with brief nods. Some mouths closed permanently, not out of stubbornness, but necessity. There was dignity in quiet. It became a sign of age, of having suffered long enough to know when words were too expensive. In time, even laughter became a risk. So people smiled with their eyes and said less than they felt. An unresolved thought. In a time when one aching tooth could shape your entire existence, what else did people learn to live with just because they had no other choice? You've gotten used to the ache by now. It flares when you wake, subsides when you keep quiet, and blooms again when you chew. The body adapts in its own reluctant way. It adjusts to the rot. The pain becomes part of your personality, a quiet stiffness behind your voice, a tendency to grimace when you smile. We explore not just the personal pain of dental decay, but how society as a whole adapted to it. Because in the medieval world, bad teeth were normal. Everyone had them. And so, life carried on through markets, churches, households, and even the royal court around mouths that suffered in silence. No one thought it unusual. It was just how things were. Bad breath was everyone's problem. Halitosis, bad breath, wasn't a rare affliction. It was an assumption. In towns, the mix of poor hygiene, rotting teeth, and limited access to fresh water meant everyone's breath carried the tang of decay. You didn't comment on it. You didn't flinch. You turned your head subtly or spoke facing away. In the upper classes, chewing herbs became a habit. Parsley, sage, mint, and cloves were favored for their sweetening effect. Nobles carried pomanders, scented balls filled with spices to mask not just breath, but the general stench of life. But poor villagers didn't have that luxury. You chewed wood ash or crushed fennel if you had it. And most of the time, you did nothing. Because no one expected breath to be pleasant. They only hoped it wasn't dangerous. Oral hygiene, medieval style. Toothbrushes didn't exist in medieval Europe, not in the modern sense. But that doesn't mean people did nothing. Some chew sticks to clean the teeth. Others rubbed cloth or rough linen over their molars after meals. Ash, crushed eggshells, salt, and even powdered brick were used as abrasives. Mouth rinses included vinegar, wine, or a brine made from herbs and urine. People picked their teeth with goose feathers, bones, or sticks. Still, most didn't clean regularly. Hygiene was reactive, not preventive. You cleaned your teeth when they hurt, not before. And by then, it was often too late. Dentistry in the monasteries. Oddly enough, the most consistent oral care came from monasteries. Monks, especially those trained in medicine, kept records of remedies for toothworms, imaginary creatures thought to cause toothaches. They mixed mustard seed, opium, vinegar, and myrrh. Some recipes included burnt leather or oil of clove. Cauterization, burning the gum with a hot iron, was occasionally used to kill the pain, or the patient. The monastic infirmary was a place of peace, prayer, and screaming. Still, they documented their efforts. And in some cases, monks performed extractions, with cleaner hands than most barbers. Children and teeth, a brief life of chewing. Children in the Middle Ages lost their baby teeth like children everywhere, but the second set didn't last long. By their late teens, many had visible decay. Few would reach 30 with all their teeth intact. Still, toothaches were treated with skepticism. Children were expected to endure pain quietly. If a child cried of a sore mouth, they were often ignored unless the swelling made it impossible to eat. Even then, the response was rarely kindness. It was garlic paste, or a slap, or if they were lucky, a prayer. Children learned early that complaining about teeth rarely led to help. It only reminded others of their own pain. Women, teeth, and social expectations. In towns and cities, a woman's appearance mattered more. A missing front tooth might lower her marriage prospects. Pale gums were prized. Lips free of swelling were admired. Some women scrubbed their teeth with wool, dipped in wine or honey water. But this was cosmetic. They couldn't stop the decay, only mask it. Women were expected to bear pain with dignity. A toothache was no excuse to be idle, unkempt, or unkind. In noble courts, women whispered when their mouths hurt. They wore veils not just for modesty, but to hide swelling. In rural homes, they worked through the pain grinding grain, boiling stew, nursing children while clutching the side of their jaw. There was no time for rest. No room for pity. The wealthy, better teeth but not by much. It's easy to imagine nobles with perfect smiles, but they had their own problems. The upper class consumed more sugar than peasants. Imported from the East, sugar was expensive but widely prized. Nobles added it to meat, wine, bread, and even medicines. Their teeth decayed faster. Some compensated with powdered tooth cleansers, alum, coral, or crushed oyster shells. Barber surgeons visited noble households for tooth pulling. They wore aprons, they brought assistants, they didn't clean their hands. Still, the wealthy had one great advantage: time. They could afford to lie in bed after a bad extraction. They could sip broth and rest. Peasants didn't have that luxury. They pulled their own teeth, or didn't. Markets, pain, and public dentistry. In many towns, you could find a tooth puller in the market. He wore bright clothes, shouted loudly, and claimed miraculous cures. He held up bloody teeth as trophies. Sometimes he pulled real ones, sometimes he faked it. He might numb the gum with cold ale, then yank, or he might pocket your coin and vanish into the crowd. Crowds gathered to watch. Some for entertainment, some for hope. If you were desperate, you sat on the stool and opened your mouth. If not, you just watched someone else scream. The church in pain as penance. In a religious society, suffering wasn't just expected, it was sometimes holy. The pain of the tooth was seen by some as a trial, a reminder of mortality, a reflection of sin. You didn't curse your bad molar. You offered it up to God. You believed that pain purified, that your aching jaw cleansed your soul. Some saints were said to endure terrible mouth afflictions with joy. You tried to follow their example, and in that way your silence became sacred. When the ache was gone, eventually one of two things happened. The tooth fell out on its own, with a pop and a gush of blood, or it was pulled by a man with rough hands and a quicker wrist than you'd expected. Either way, the silence afterward was profound. No more throbbing, no more heat in the cheek, no more fear of chewing. Just a hole where something used to be. You ran your tongue over the gap again and again. It felt like freedom, until the next one started to hurt. An unresolved thought. If pain becomes part of your identity, what happens to you when the pain finally disappears? The pain is gone. At first you think it's a mistake, a quiet day, a trick of the nerves. But it continues, one day, two, a week. The molar that plagued your nights and soured your meals has disappeared, either yanked out by the blacksmith's tongs or fallen out in your sleep. All that's left is a fleshy hole, tender but calm. And now you feel strange. Not joyful, not exactly, but light, unanchored. You've lived with the pain so long it had become a habit. Its absence is unfamiliar, almost lonely. We explore what life looked like after the ache, what it meant to live toothless, how people adjusted to a quieter kind of suffering, and how, long before electric toothbrushes or dental insurance, they found ways to carry on with less. Toothless but not voiceless. To be toothless in the Middle Ages was not rare, it was expected. Old men gummed their food. Grandmothers mashed boiled peas and milk with their tongue. Children whispered about who had how many teeth left. Losing your teeth didn't mark the end of your usefulness. It marked the beginning of a different kind of life, softer, slower, quieter. Your speech changed, your voice grew muffled, certain consonants slipped, you learned to compensate. You gestured more, you nodded, you grunted approval, you smiled less, but not because you weren't pleased. You just knew your smile no longer looked the way it used to. You weren't ashamed, but you were careful. Meals for the toothless. With the pain gone, you could eat again. But not everything. Hard bread became a challenge. Apples, nuts, dried beans off the table now. You stuck to soft pottage, boiled greens, stews, and gruel. If you were lucky, the house had cheese curds, soft fish, or eggs. You learned to soak your bread in broth. You made do with turnips. Eating was still a slow act. But now it was quiet, peaceful. You took small bites, you chewed with care, you didn't flinch when swallowing. And sometimes in the hush of supper, you found gratitude. The wisdom of the toothless. In time, people came to you for advice. Not because of your age or your knowledge, but because of your teeth. A full mouth was a sign of youth, of untested pain, but a toothless smile meant you endured something. You'd suffered long and survived. In a village, that counted for more than books. You became the one who remembered how to soften bark for tea, who knew which herbs dulled the edge of infection, who had sat through the whole of winter with a swollen jaw and still sowed seed in spring. Your silence became wisdom. Your missing teeth became marks of experience. What tooth pulling looked like in art. By the 1500s, tooth pulling had become a theme in paintings, especially Dutch and German works. Artists like Lucas van Leyden and Caravaggio depicted scenes of open mouths, grimaces, forceps, and crowds. These were not heroic images. They were earthy, humorous, a little cruel. The tooth puller was often a charlatan, the patient a fool. Money changed hands, pain followed. The art captured something society knew well, that pain and commerce, relief and regret often shared the same chair. Tooth pulling wasn't just a service. It was a performance. False teeth if you were lucky. False teeth existed, in a way. Wealthy individuals sometimes had dentures made from bone, ivory, or even teeth taken from other humans, usually the poor, or the dead. These dentures were held in place with wire or silk thread. They were uncomfortable, unstable, and expensive. Most people didn't bother. They let the gaps show, they adjusted their bite, they lived without. But the idea of restoring a full smile, of reclaiming what had been lost, was already beginning to take root. It would take centuries more before it became normal. Medicine catches up slowly. By the 1700s, dentistry began to form as a profession. Pierre Fauchard, a French surgeon, published Le Chirurgien Dentiste in 1728, the first comprehensive book on dental science. He described cavities, fillings, and the use of dental mirrors. He outlined surgical techniques. He argued that sugar caused tooth decay. But for the average medieval person, none of this was relevant. They were long dead by the time progress arrived. Their experience was one of improvisation, of folklore, of enduring what couldn't be fixed. Still, they laid the foundation. They showed what it meant to live with the problem long before solutions appeared. The teeth left behind. Archaeologists today can read history through teeth. In burial sites, worn molars show signs of heavy grinding, proof of stone-laced flour. Cavities tell stories of sudden sugar in the diet. Abscessed jaws show how far infections spread. Bone loss marks the quiet passage of chronic pain. Sometimes teeth are found loose in the grave, having fallen out before death. In rare cases, skulls show healed sockets, proof that someone survived an extraction. The bones don't lie. They whisper of pain, of meals eaten in caution, of nights spent clutching the cheek. They show us that mouths were battlefields. The final smile. To die toothless was not shameful. It was, in some ways, expected. The dying smiled one last time, not with teeth, but with relief. They knew the ache would not return, that nothing would swell or rot or throb again. The mouth closed in peace. The silence of the body matched the silence they had long carried in life. No more chewing, no more wincing, no more clove on the tongue. Just rest. A thoughtful reflection. Long before Novocaine or dental drills, people lived with pain as a companion. They adjusted, they adapted, they endured. What does it mean, then, that modern comfort sometimes leaves us less patient and perhaps less prepared for the small, slow agonies of life? Story 6. The infinite waiting of 19th century train travel. You've arrived early. It's 1848. You're standing on a platform in a small town along one of England's newer branch lines. There is no train in sight, only a rusted bench, a telegraph wire stretching overhead, and a station master who hasn't spoken in an hour. The timetable is pinned to a wall, printed in type so small you need to squint. It claims that 11:03 should arrive punctually on the dot, but you know that's not true. Everyone knows that's not true. You don't come to the station for the train, you come to wait. We begin our descent into the rhythms of 19th century rail life, not the thrilling chug of the engine or the panoramic countryside, but the dull, restless hours of delay, uncertainty, and institutionalized stillness. Trains reshaped the world, but they also taught humanity something new. How to wait together in silence. The first stations were just sheds. In the earliest days of train travel, a station wasn't much more than a wooden platform, a roof held up by beams, and a clerk with a whistle. There were no clocks, no seats, no heated waiting rooms. You stood in your coat, you checked the sky, you tapped your foot slowly so you wouldn't forget you were alive. These stations weren't designed for comfort. They were meant to organize bodies into lines and funnel them toward the next destination. Everything was temporary. Everything was conditional. If the train came, it came. If it didn't, you stayed. Timetables and lies. The idea of a railway timetable was revolutionary. Before trains, time belonged to towns. Noon was when the church bell said so. Later meant after chores. Soon meant before dark. But trains needed clocks. They needed synchronization. And so time was printed. Timetables promised exactness. They listed departure times down to the minute: 7:47, 11:03, 2:16. But these promises were aspirational. Trains ran late or early or not at all. Bridges collapsed, engines stalled, signals failed, cows blocked the tracks. And the passengers lined up in rows. Clutching tickets and expectations, learned that printed time didn't mean real time. You learned to read the schedule as metaphor. The waiting room wasn't for waiting. In larger stations, there was a room with a sign, "Waiting Room." But it wasn't cozy. Benches lined the walls. The stove smoked. The air smelled of coal, sweat, and wet wool. If you were lucky, someone had brought a newspaper. If you weren't, the only reading material was the safety notice nailed to the door. There were no refreshments, no music, no announcements. Children squirmed, mothers hushed them, men stared at the floor. The room was not a place to pass the time. It was a place where time passed you. Luggage not yet on wheels. You brought your own bags. There were no porters on smaller lines, and wheels on luggage hadn't been invented yet. You lifted, you dragged, you rearranged on your lap. The more you packed, the more you suffered. And so people learned to wait with their belongings close. A suitcase became a seat, a carpet bag a pillow, a parcel of bread and jam a minor event. You didn't check your baggage. You lived with it. Just like the waiting. The sound of nothing. A station between trains was one of the quietest places on earth. You might hear a distant whistle, or the wind rattling the station sign, but mostly there was just stillness. No engine to fill the space, no overhead announcement, no screens. Even the birds seemed cautious. People rarely spoke. What was there to say? I hope it comes soon. It's later than usual. Perhaps the 1:15 was canceled. And then silence. You wrapped your coat tighter. You sat down again. You counted the minutes, then lost track. Clocks real and imagined. Some stations had clocks, large ones, bolted to the wall like ancient gods. They ticked slowly, some didn't tick at all. When the second hand moved, it became an event. People turned their heads, a child pointed. But mostly you guessed the time by the quality of the light, the angle of a shadow, the stiffness in your legs. Time moved differently here. It wasn't linear. It folded in on itself, stretched, recoiled. The longer you waited, the less you believed in time at all. Who you waited with? A merchant in a thick coat, a widow with a box of ashes, a boy clutching a goat by the neck, a soldier, silent, fingers twitching. You didn't know their names, you didn't ask. But you all shared one thing, the pause. And in that shared pause, something strange happened. You became companions, not in conversation, but in discomfort. The way soldiers bond under fire, you bonded under tedium. Together, you endured the uncertainty. Together, you stared at the tracks. The station master wasn't worried. He knew. He always knew. The train was delayed due to congestion, or stalled outside Wigan, or waiting on the bridge to clear. He didn't explain, he didn't apologize. He just adjusted his hat, tapped his pen on the ledger, and stared out the window with the expression of a man who had outwaited every train in England. He didn't need to know when it would arrive, only that it would. Eventually. Snacks if you were desperate. In larger stations, you might find a kiosk selling rock-hard biscuits, warm milk, or newspapers from last Tuesday. But in smaller towns, you brought your own. A piece of cheese, a pocket of raisins, a heel of bread, maybe a slice of pie if your wife packed it in the morning. These became events. You unwrapped the cloth slowly. You ate with intention. You rationed each bite, because eating filled the time. And there was a lot of time to fill. An unresolved thought. You watched the rails stretch into the fog, uncertain whether they promised arrival or simply more waiting. In a world newly bound by iron and steam, did we gain progress or only learn to wait more precisely? You're still here. An hour past schedule, the train has not arrived. The station master has mumbled something about a signal failure near a tunnel, or perhaps a delay from the main line. The specifics don't matter. You sit back down on the wooden bench that has long since adopted the shape of your coat. You think of your destination. It is, for now, theoretical. So you wait. We go deeper into the landscape of delays, the emotional rituals of passengers, the psychological shift caused by the railway's promise of speed that rarely materialized, and the curious culture that grew around stillness and suspended motion. The myth of speed. Trains were supposed to be fast. And they were on paper, on posters, in the imaginations of Victorian industrialists who described journeys with words like express, lightning, and unstoppable. But reality was slower. Track switches failed, telegraphs cut out, engines overheated, rain flooded tunnels, cattle wandered across embankments. Passengers who once walked for days now waited for hours, staring down tracks that delivered neither speed nor certainty. You began to question the promise. Was the slowness more tolerable when it came without expectation? Had walking been easier because it required no trust in strangers? Ticket in hand, but nowhere to go. Your ticket is a small rectangle of stiff paper, inked with station names and a scrawled departure time that now feels like a cruel joke. It's not refundable. It's not transferable. It's a contract of hope. You turn it over in your hand. You press it between your fingers like a prayer card. You don't dare crumple it. It's all you have that links you to the idea of movement. You wonder if trains are the only places where hope is printed and delayed at once. Weather was the real conductor. Snow buried the tracks, fog blinded the engineers, ice seized the switches, rain washed out the gravel beds beneath the rails. In an era before whether radar or de-icing chemicals, nature ruled the railway. A winter storm might strand you for an entire day at a remote junction. You and a dozen strangers, huddled near a sputtering stove, sharing biscuits and boiled sweets while the wind howled through the gaps in the wall. Delays became events in themselves. Weather became the real schedule. And you foolish, you had expected to arrive today. The station master's logic. You asked when the train would come. He replied, it should have been here. You asked again. He said, it often waits for the main line to clear. Eventually, you stopped asking. Because the station master was a kind of oracle cryptic, unmoved, surrounded by ledgers no one else could read. He didn't apologize, he didn't explain. He noted. His pencil moved slowly, as if to prove that everything was under control, if not understood. The ritual of checking the tracks. Every 15 minutes, someone rose from the bench. They paced to the platform's edge. They peered down the rails, past the curve, into the thick mist or pale horizon. They didn't expect to see a train, but it felt necessary, as if their gaze might summon motion, as if checking the track made the train more real. Soon, others joined shoulder to shoulder in stillness. And when they turned back, there were no words exchanged, just nods, a shared understanding that time was not something you passed, but something that passed over you. Children learn to wait early. At first, they fidget. They ask questions. When is it coming? Why is it late? What if it never comes? Then they grow quiet. They lie on the bench. They invent games with crumbs. They poke each other until one begins to cry, and then they are hushed, gently but firmly. Waiting becomes a lesson, in patience, in obedience, in boredom. You wonder if train travel taught children how to endure adult life. After all, what is growing up but learning to wait more quietly? The post and the clock. Letters were delayed with the trains, so were newspapers, so was time. In some towns, the mail coach's arrival synchronized the day. If it was late, appointments slipped. Markets delayed opening. Even church services were postponed so the vicar could finish his reading of the London Times. Train travel reshaped not just geography, but the tempo of entire towns. But when trains ran late, that tempo dissolved. People waited in shops with half-set prices. Horses stood idle at hitching posts. Whole towns held their breath for the sound of wheels. And when it came, they exhaled. Until the next delay. Stories filled the gaps. Sometimes a man told a story. It wasn't good, it wasn't short. But it was a break from the silence. He recounted a journey from 5 years ago, when the train derailed and no one noticed for half an hour. Or he described a cousin who waited so long that her marriage proposal expired. People chuckled or sighed or nodded. Stories didn't fix the wait, but they filled the cracks in time. They gave weight to an otherwise shapeless hour. Station dogs and familiar faces. There was often a dog. No one quite knew who owned it. It slept on the warm stones near the station stove and greeted passengers with a yawn. Children played with its ears. Adults fed it crusts. It became a kind of mascot, a living proof that someone always waited longer than you. And of course, there were familiar faces. The man in the brown hat, always reading the paper. The old woman with a parasol heading nowhere in particular. The young couple who didn't speak, just stared into the fog. These people made up the background of your delay. You were all characters in the same unmoving scene. An unresolved thought. The train will come eventually. But once it does, and motion resumes, will you miss the silence you've come to understand? And then a sound. Distant at first like a whisper dragged over steel, a trembling in the rails, a vibration in your feet, heads lift. The station master straightens. The man in the brown hat folds his newspaper. You stand. There it is, a plume of smoke rounding the bend, a metal face pushing through fog. The train is arriving. Or is it? We examine what arrival really meant in an era where transit was uncertain, delayed, and ultimately unsatisfying. Because the irony of the 19th century train system was not in its failures, but in how it convinced a whole world to move, while never quite letting it arrive. The train slows but never stops quickly. The engine approaches with a long screech. The station doesn't tremble, but you do. You brace yourself physically, emotionally for motion. The train never truly arrives. It decelerates. It groans. It exhales steam in slow, indecisive sighs. It pulls alongside the platform as if unsure whether to commit. And then it stops. Almost apologetically. Doors creak, conductors hop down. And just like that, you're allowed to move again. The rush that follows stillness. Suddenly, stillness becomes chaos. Porters yell, passengers shuffle, bags drop, children shout, a goat protests. There is no real order, just inertia breaking. You feel your muscles ache not from movement, but from the anticipation of movement. Your legs resist, confused after so much quiet. The rhythm of the station collapses. You were still for hours. Now you have exactly 90 seconds to board. The human body is not made for such contrasts. Seats that weren't yours. You climb aboard. There are no assigned seats. You walk past rows of occupied benches. Some people feign sleep to avoid making eye contact. Others glare, daring you to sit beside them. You find a space next to a man who smells of onions and quiet grief. You nod. He does not respond. The train jolts. And you are off. Or rather, you begin the next wait. motion without sensation. Despite what novels say, the countryside does not blur past. The trees do not whip by in poetic rhythm. Instead, you chug, slowly, with hesitation. You stop again 10 minutes later for no discernible reason. No one explains. You learn not to ask. Even in motion, you wait. The window as distraction. You stare out the window. You see fields, cottages, livestock. Sometimes a boy waves. You do not wave back. It's not rudeness, it's inertia. Your body is here. Your mind is still at the station. You imagine all the things you could have done with the lost hours. You don't resent them, but you do count them. And then you stop counting. Because numbers don't help on a train. Stations you pass but never enter. You stop at towns you've never heard of. The names are painted in flacking white letters on wooden signs. Sladeburn, Whittlesea, Ironbridge. Sometimes no one gets on or off. Still the train waits. You wonder if waiting is part of the journey, not an interruption of it. Each pause reminds you. The railway does not exist to move you quickly, but to show you the geography of delay. You become a cartographer of slowness. When the train reaches your destination, eventually the conductor calls your stop. You rise, gather your bag, and step down onto another platform. This station looks almost identical to the one you left. Same bench, same sign, same waiting room. You wonder if you've gone anywhere at all. The world has not changed. Only the clock has. You ask for a carriage. There is none. The horse you were promised to meet is late, or perhaps forgotten. You wait again. But this time it's different. You're not angry. The wait no longer feels like a problem. It feels like the normal state of things. Trains didn't just transport people. They taught them to surrender to uncertainty, to organize their lives around the arbitrary authority of timetables that were never kept. You find a place to sit. You pull a heel of bread from your coat. You chew. Arrival was always a theory. The 19th century railway was built on the illusion of certainty. It gave the world clocks, compartments, and cities closer together, but it also gave us anxiety, silence, and the strange companionship of strangers who share your frustration. The journey always started with a schedule. But the schedule was not the truth. The truth was the waiting. And in that waiting, something quietly evolved: modern patience. The lesson of the platform. Perhaps you never truly arrived. Perhaps the platform became your real destination. Because once you left it, you missed the clarity of its stillness, the honest boredom, the shared glances, the slow ticking of a clock that never hurried. Trains made the world faster, but they also made it pause. And in that pause, we learned to listen to time itself. A final reflection. Before bullet trains and airport lounges, before apps that showed arrivals in real time, people stood on wooden platforms and simply waited. Not because they liked it, but because they had to. And maybe, in all our speed today, we've lost the discipline that delay once taught us. That time is not just something to spend, but something to notice.